Hi, this is Kevin. My goal today is to make a quick video for you to get you started with Docker Compose, but specifically running in Proxmox in a container, not a VM. Containers are going to be a lighter weight option. They're not necessarily as friendly for doing USB pass-through. If you're going to do USB pass-through, you're going to want to use a VM, I think, but we don't need that for today. For the operating system for my container, I'm going to use Alpine. It's a popular lightweight operating system. Works well with containers. So here in Proxmox, I want to double check and see if I've got the latest container template for Alpine. I'm going to come to my container template. So I've got 3.16 and 3.17. I think this 3.17 is the latest, but let's check. I'm going to click templates. Search for Alpine. Yep, 3.17 here is the latest. That's what I've already got. You could select it and click download, but I don't need to. From there, let's just go ahead and create the container. I'm going to right click on Proxmox here and say create CT, which is the same as create container. I'm going to give it a name. The one I'm making is just a throwaway. I'm just demonstrating here, but this is what you would do on your own. So I'm going to call it Docker Test 1. I'm going to give it a password. This is the root password for the container, so you should make it something secure. Always a good idea. Next, we're going to pick the template for our container. Here, we're using this Alpine 3.17. I would just use whatever is the current. I'm not going to worry about disks, CPU, and memory here. I'm going to take the defaults. You'd have to scale it for what your needs are, and you're going to have to play with it for a while to probably figure out what some of those needs are. So I'm just going to take defaults because we're not going to get too deep into this. Next. Getting to network, I'm going to select DHCP here. And my network will assign automatically an IP address. I would recommend that you configure your networking to automatically use the MAC address that's going to be provided with the container and use that to get a static IP address onto the machine, not necessarily static. You're using DHCP, or you can do it as a static, your choice. So we're ready to go here. We're going to say start after created. It just takes a moment to spin this thing up. It's so fast. By the time I click on it and go to console, it's already spun up. I'm going to log in as root with the password that I defined. There are a few things that we want to do to get this set up for the first time. You're probably noticing on the right I've got a cheat sheet that I haven't used yet, but I am using it, and I will provide this. Look in the description of the video. It's terse, but if you're following along, it should provide what you need. You can't paste into the console here, so we're going to spend as little time here in this console as possible. But so we're going to be typing it. The command I'm entering here as root is using APK, which is a package manager, to install, which is what add means, two packages, OpenRC and OpenSSH. OpenRC will help us control how things start up on the machine, and OpenSSH will let us SSH into the container from a more convenient terminal. So let's get those installed. I'm going to run rc update add sshd. This will make rc update add SSHD. This will start SSHD upon system boot, so that's great. And then we're going to start it manually for this boot. The next thing I want to do is create a new user. I'm going to name my user Kevin, but you can name this user anything you'd like. Some people might name this Docker. It's easy for me to remember Kevin, though, since that's my name. We'll say add user Kevin. And again, give this a secure password. And I'd recommend using a password manager as well. I personally use 1Password, but use whatever works for you. So we have created the user and defined a good password for it. I'm going to install sudo next. This will allow users to execute things as root when they are not the root user. I'm going to edit this file that now exists on my system called sudoers in Etsy sudoers. I'm probably saying that funny. Near the bottom of this file, we will find this user privilege section. For root, I'm going to copy that and change it to the user Kevin and spell it correctly. So I'm adding myself as a sudoer on this system. You can't just write that file. I'm going to write with an exclamation point, which is a force write because this is a file that's been marked read-only. But root can handle it. And the next file I'd like to edit will allow Kevin to SSH into the machine. So that's Etsy SSH SSHD config. Right down under authentication, I'm going to add a line that says allow users Kevin. You could figure out pretty easily how to let root SSH in. I generally avoid making any changes like that. If I want to access something with root, I'll SSH in as the user I just created, Kevin, and then I'll use sudo to execute things as root. It's a better way to do it. Finally, let's restart SSHD. Then it'll pick up the configuration that we just made from SSHD config. Okay, that's done. Next, I need to know the IP address that was assigned by my networking. 192.168.1.220. I'm just going to update my notes here on the right in case I need to remember it later, which I might. So as I mentioned, console here is not the optimum way to interact with this. My preference would be to use something like Windows Terminal. That's what this is. So I'm going to SSH into the machine now. Using the username Kevin, or whatever username you chose, at the IP address that we just found from ifconfig. It's the first time we're connecting to it, so we're going to accept the fingerprint, the password that we created for the user, and we are now logged into Alpine. A quick who am I shows I'm logged in as Kevin. The first thing I want to test is my sudo access. And so I'm going to change to the root account. So sudo sudash is the command that I use to switch to root. We will type in again my password, not root's password. Who am I now? I am root. Okay. The reason we're switching here to root is now to install Docker and make sure we have access to Docker Compose. We need to edit the repositories that are used by Alpine in order to get the latest version of Docker and Docker Compose. So we've got these two repositories that are already in this etc apk repositories file. I'm going to add these two more. These are where we're going to get those Docker images, the packages. So we'll save this file out. And now we want to run an apk update. Our next command will now add, so apk add to install Docker and Docker CLI Compose. So Docker is installed, but it's not yet running. So let's go ahead and first set up Docker to start at boot using rc update add docker boot. The next command that we're going to use is to start Docker for this boot. We've already booted, so we don't need to reboot right now. So let's do a service docker start. We can see Docker has now started up correctly. Finally, we can see if service has an opinion if Docker is running. And service does seem to think that Docker is running. Before we log out of root, I want to run one more command. And I want to run add group to put Kevin, the account that we've created, into the group Docker, which now exists. Okay, so if we tail etc password, we can see Kevin exists in here with a user ID of 1000 and a default group ID of 1000. And if we look in the group file, Kevin has a group ID of 1000, and the group Docker, Kevin is now a member of. I'm going to log out of root. I'm going to log out of Kevin. I'm now going to SSH back into Kevin on my container. Since I haven't set up SSH keys here, I'm going to use my password. I'll verify I'm logged in as Kevin. And now we should be able to Docker PS. And yeah, everything is configured. Kevin can now create Docker containers. But we want to use Docker Compose, not plain Docker. I don't think you should start with Docker at all. You should start with Docker Compose. It is the way to go. I've picked sort of an arbitrary Docker container for you to install. It's one that I use personally. I think it's a nice little container, and it's easy to set up. Let's look at it real quick on Docker Hub. The common way you are going to find new Docker containers is potentially Docker Hub. It shows you, you can search for almost any app that you want to run. The other way to commonly do that, we'll come back to this page, is that I might type Uptime Kuma Docker into Google. And both of these two links are very helpful. Either one of these would help. Either the GitHub, and then it's going to come down in here and tell you how to install it with Docker. Every open source app that can run on a web server in Linux, you can run in Docker pretty much, and they will all tell you how to do it. It's amazing. Let's come back over here to the Docker Hub link. Unfortunately, their example here does not give us Docker Compose. They're giving us plain Docker, which I tell you, you don't want to use. Instead, we are going to observe what they're telling us about here. You'll become familiar with this in no time flat, but the critical things are which container name we want to pull. So up here in the top you find it. It's for this one, it's Lewis Lamb / Uptime Kuma. And we can look at the parameters that they're passing to it. Specifically here we're looking at the port and volume parameters. So these are the TCP ports that it uses on the right internally, on the left externally. I'll explain all that in just a minute. And the volumes, where data is stored. So let's actually create my Docker Compose. I'm going to make a folder here. Sorry. I'm going to make a folder here just so we can keep all of our Docker stuff nice and together. I'm going to create a file called Docker Compose.yml. This is a YAML file. If you're familiar with YAML, you should have no problem with this. If you're not familiar with YAML, you should have no problem with this. I'm not going to explain every bit in detail of this file, but it's really straightforward. The first line, this is the version for Docker Compose. So Docker Compose knows how to read this file. Then we have the services stanza. All of the applications that are in your Docker Compose stack, and there can be any number of these services, would appear here under services. We're only defining one, Uptime Kuma. As I mentioned, we've got the container name here, Lewis Lamb / Uptime Kuma. The last bit here, the :latest, is a tag that I can specify to say when I pull the application, not when I start it, but when I pull it, when I request a new version, always get the latest. You can specify a specific version if you like. My preference is latest. Container name is a name of my choosing, optional. Restart is optional. My preference is unless stopped. If the container that's running Docker Compose gets restarted, or if the entire Proxmox machine gets restarted, this is how Docker will decide if applications should be started up. So if it was running before the machine got restarted, Docker will automatically restart that container. These last two stanzas are the really important ones, and the things to remember are in volumes. This is actual data. So on the left side is local to this machine. On right side is within the container. So Uptime Kuma's application is storing the application state in /app/data. The application always stores the state in that folder. But because we have a volume here, I can make the state stored in that folder be stored locally. So outside of the container. And I do that in this folder, Uptime Kuma, that I have in my current directory, which is my Docker directory here. So on the right side, app data, that's to the container. On the left side, that's local. So the same thing is with ports. So the Uptime Kuma application, the service, will actually be listening on port 3001. So on the right is in the container. On the left is local. So let's actually change this to 2001. So on my machine here, 192.168.1.120, it's going to be listening on port 2001 and then relaying those requests inside the container to port 3001. Let's write that file. We need to make that directory where the data is going to be stored. So let's look at that Docker Compose file. So that's in this local folder, Uptime Kuma. So let's make that folder so it exists. We look now, we do an ls, and we've got one file, docker compose.yaml, and that's always going to be the exact file name, and a folder that I just created where local state will be stored when the service is run, uptime kuma. So let's go ahead and run this. We'll say docker compose up. This is going to start my entire stack. I only have one service defined, but I could have a dozen in there, and this would bring up my entire stack. Got to spell it correctly then. So it's going to pull the images, pull the bits for each one of my services, and then it's going to start it up. So let's watch it do that. It only takes a moment. And as soon as it pulls all of the data, it will immediately start the application and start outputting the logs from that service. So we see that it has come up and it is listening on 3001. So inside, it's listening on 3001. But if I go to port 2001 in my browser, you will see Uptime Kuma is running, and it's running through Docker Compose on that Proxmox container. Switching back over here to my terminal, this isn't the way we would normally run this. This is useful for looking at the logs and debugging a new service. But usually I just have this running in the background. The way I personally like to do this is with, I start this up with a shell script. I call that update and restart.sh. So this is not a bash shell script, but just a regular shell script. We'll paste it in. The first line is magic shell script notation saying to execute this file using shell /bin/shell. The logic in this file is 3 pieces that all will only execute if the previous piece was successful. So the first thing it does is docker compose pull. This pulls the bits for all of our Docker Compose services. And when I had my latest tag on there, it's going to pull the latest. If there's something newer, it's going to get all of the newers. Assuming that was successful, that's what the double and sign means. It's going to do a Docker Compose down. What that does is the equivalent of that Control-C saw before. It takes any of the services in my Docker Compose stack and stops any of them that are running. The last thing we do here, assuming that didn't have a failure, is Docker Compose up, which you've already seen. That starts the entire stack. But I'm adding an additional flag here, -d, that detaches, so it leaves it running and does not log to the command line. So if we do docker ps, nothing is currently running. If we do docker compose ps, it gives you a very similar nothing is running. If I do, oops, before we can run that shell script, we have to say chmod +x and the name of the script. So what we're doing is using change mode plus executable, so we're adding executable to that script. And now we can execute that script. It quickly tries to pull the latest images, and we see that everything was already up to date. It brings it down, but there was nothing to bring down. Then it brings it up. And if we switch back to our browser, it's running. The last command that I'll show you is docker compose logs and then you can give that with a -F. So if you just do Docker compose logs, it tails the logs for you. If you add a -F, that means to follow. And that will sit there and output the logs, and you can watch the application logs right from there. Hit Control-C. It's only stopping that log. So if we say Docker compose PS, we see that Uptime Kuma is up and healthy. It was created about a minute ago, and it's been running for 57 seconds. We can also see we've got this port mapping, 2001 local to inside the container 3001. Hope that was helpful. Docker really opens up a lot of possibilities and makes things really easy to shuffle around. If you do Docker compose down, and if you move the contents of this folder to another machine running Docker, you can transport the app just as simply as that. Or you can take a portion of Docker Compose if you need to move a service from one Docker Compose stack to another. It's super easy. All right, thanks. Have a great one.